Long before modern Europe was born, there was a dynasty that claimed more than royal blood. They claimed the favor of heaven itself. The Merovingians, the long-haired kings of ancient France, ruled with symbols of bees, stars, and sacred seas. But their story didn't end when history said it did. It was buried, rewritten, and guarded by secret orders that watched from the shadows. From the halls of the Vatican to the crypts of forgotten abbeys, whispers still speak of a hidden bloodline, a sacred legacy that may still flow through the veins of those who walk among us. This is not just a story of kings and crowns. It's a journey through the fabric of faith, myth, and power. Join us as we uncover the truth behind Europe's forbidden dynasty, the bloodline they tried to erase. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mysteries of Earth. Long before the crowned heads of modern France walked the halls of Versailles, before Charlemagne's empire, and before the Church's grip shaped Europe, there existed a dynasty shrouded in mystery, the Merovingians. They emerged not in the glory of Rome, but in its twilight, when the empire's legions had vanished, and chaos ruled the lands of Gaul. In this silence of collapsing order, a new kind of kingdom began to stir. One born not merely from conquest, but from myth. The people whispered of kings touched by the divine, men whose blood carried an ancient secret. They were rulers and priests, warriors and mystics, their very existence walking the border between legend and history. Their founder, Merovech, was said to be born of two worlds. Some claimed he was the son of a sea creature, a being of divine waters that mingled with mortal flesh. His descendants, the Merovingians, carried this tale like a sacred prophecy. Their hair flowed long, uncut and untamed, believed to hold the essence of their divine right to rule. They were not kings by conquest, but by destiny, monarchs who claimed heaven itself as their witness. The ruins of Roman cities still dotted the landscape, silent reminders of a lost empire. Yet amid this decay, the Merovingians built something new, a fusion of ancient paganism and rising Christian belief. Their courts were places where druids and bishops might walk the same halls, where omens were read beside scripture. To the people of early medieval Europe, they represented stability, a flickering light in the dark age that followed Rome's fall. But their power was more than earthly. The Merovingians believed themselves chosen, not by man, but by fate. Their symbols, from the sacred bee to the fleur-de-lis, spoke of resurrection, immortality, and divine balance. Bees, it was said, carried the souls of kings, eternal, industrious, and pure. Such emblems were not ornaments of rule, but messages to the ages, reminders that their lineage was more than human. As their influence spread across Gaul, so too did their legend. To allies, they were sacred monarchs preserving civilization's spark. To enemies, they were sorcerer kings, their courts filled with omens and hidden rites. And yet, history, written by the victors of later dynasties, tells little of them. Their records were erased, their tombs sealed, their bloodlines scattered to whispers. What remains of the Merovingians today are fragments, golden bees unearthed in forgotten graves, inscriptions worn by time, and chronicles that speak of kings who ruled with wisdom and mystery. But behind these fragments lies a greater question. Who were they, truly? Were they the last heirs of Rome's order, or the first bearers of a deeper, hidden truth, one that merged the spiritual and the sovereign? In the forgotten dawn of medieval Europe, the Merovingians stood as a bridge between worlds, between empire and faith, myth and history, man and the divine. Their story is not merely of kingship, but of something eternal, the human desire to trace power back to the sacred, to find in our bloodlines the echoes of the gods. And so, the tale of the forgotten kings of Europe begins, not as a chapter in history's book, but as a mystery that refuses to fade, buried beneath centuries of silence, waiting once more to be remembered. In the shadow of Rome's collapse, Europe was a land fractured by tribes and torn by faith. Among these shifting kingdoms rose a warrior whose destiny would change the course of history, Clovis I, the first king of the Franks. He was more than a conqueror. He was a bridge between worlds, the pagan past and the Christian future. Clovis began as a chieftain among many, ruling a fragmented realm of warriors bound by blood and vengeance. His world was one of shifting loyalties, where battle decided truth and power spoke louder than faith. Yet within this chaos, Clovis saw something greater, a vision of unity, of a kingdom strong enough to endure the storm that had broken Rome. His conquest was not merely of land, but of souls. One by one, the tribes of Gaul fell beneath his banner, drawn not just by the sword, but by the charisma of a leader who seemed chosen by fate itself. His victories at Soissons, Tolbiac and beyond would carve the foundations of medieval France. But it was not conquest alone that would define him. It was conversion. Legend tells that in the heat of battle against the Alemanni, when defeat seemed certain, Clovis called out not to his old gods of thunder and war, but to the Christian god of his wife, Clotilde. "Grant me victory," he swore, "and I shall believe." The tide turned. His enemies fell, and history changed forever. In the baptismal waters of Rheims, surrounded by the bishops of the new faith, Clovis knelt as the old world washed away. The pagan warrior became the first Christian king of the Franks. Oil anointed his head, not as a mere symbol of power, but as a divine covenant. It was said that the Holy Spirit descended as a dove, carrying a vial of sacred oil from heaven itself, the Sainte Ampoule, a relic that would anoint French kings for more than 1,000 years. In that moment, something profound was born, the merging of two bloodlines, the fierce, untamed spirit of the pagan Franks and the sanctified order of the Christian Church. His baptism was more than ritual. It was transformation, the alchemy of history itself. Clovis had not only united the tribes of Gaul, he had united heaven and earth under one crown. But with divine favor came divine expectation. The Church, eager to shape this new monarch, whispered promises of eternal legitimacy, as long as his line remained faithful. Clovis became not merely king, but custodian of a sacred destiny. His bloodline was to be both royal and holy, carrying the burden of divine purpose through generations. As centuries passed, chroniclers would look back to that day as the genesis of a sacred bloodline, a lineage where power was sanctified, and kings ruled not only by right of conquest, but by right of heaven. And so, from the waters of Rheims, flowed the river of Europe's destiny. The Merovingians would inherit not only Clovis's throne, but his covenant, the belief that their blood was touched by divinity, their rule ordained by a force greater than man. In the quiet echo of that ancient cathedral, the ripples of one baptism still linger, the moment when faith met power, and from that union, a legend was born, the birth of a sacred bloodline that would shape the destiny of Europe for centuries to come. In the age of the Merovingians, a king's crown was not forged of gold alone, it was woven in strands of sacred hair. To cut it was to cut the very thread that bound a ruler to the divine. The long-haired monarchs of the Franks were unlike any other kings in Europe. They believed their strength, their legitimacy, and even their souls were entwined with their unshorn locks, hair that flowed like rivers of fate from crown to shoulder, shimmering with symbolic power. The origins of this strange and sacred custom reach deep into the fog of myth. Some say it began with Merovech, the semi-legendary founder of the dynasty, said to be born of both man and sea creature, a being touched by something not entirely human. His descendants carried that mark, not upon their skin, but in their hair, which was said to hold the essence of divine ancestry. To cut it was to sever their link with the supernatural, to strip away heaven's favor. In a Europe still recovering from Rome's fall, such symbols mattered. To the people, the king's hair was more than vanity. It was a living emblem of divine right. When a Merovingian king appeared before his subjects, his long hair glimmering beneath the sunlight, it was a reminder that he was not merely mortal, he was chosen. The church might anoint him, but heaven had already marked him. These long-haired monarchs became living bridges between faith and myth. They wore no ostentatious crowns of iron or jewel, for their true crown was their own hair, an eternal, incorruptible halo of legitimacy. Even when they lost wars or fell to intrigue, their people still whispered that the sacred blood and hair of the Merovingians held secret power, that to imprison or harm such a king was to defy heaven itself. The act of cutting a Merovingian's hair was not punishment, it was annihilation. Chronicles tell of deposed kings, like Childeric III, shorn of two hair sacred locks and sent to monasteries, their divine essence symbolically extinguished. Without their hair, they were no longer kings but shadows of what they had been. It was said that once the sacred strands fell, their strength and destiny fell with them. In this ancient ritual of rule, power was both visible and invisible, bound in the belief that divinity could live within the body. The Merovingians understood that their authority depended as much on faith as on force. Their hair was their scripture, their temple, their covenant. To the church, this was a dangerous kind of holiness, one that challenged its own authority. For if divine favor could flow directly through blood and bone, what need was there for priests or popes? And so began a subtle struggle, not for territory or treasure, but for the ownership of divinity itself. As centuries passed, the image of the long-haired kings faded from the chronicles, replaced by cleaner, holier, more obedient monarchs. Yet their legend endured, a memory of rulers who saw their own bodies as relics of the divine. Even today, the symbolism of hair persists in rituals, in myths, in silent gestures of reverence and rebellion. It is the oldest mark of vitality and spirit, of something untamed within humanity that resists being cut away. The Merovingian kings understood this truth, that power, like faith, must be lived, not worn. And in the flowing strands of their sacred hair, they carried the shimmering echo of a forgotten belief, that heaven's light, once bound to flesh, could never be fully severed. Beneath the soil of northern France, in a tomb untouched for centuries, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary. Tiny golden bees, hundreds of them, perfectly preserved. They were not mere ornaments. To the Merovingians, they were the mark of eternity, the sacred emblem of kings who claimed their right to rule not by the sword, but by the mysteries of nature itself. Long before Christian symbols would crown European kings, the bee was already ancient, a creature of light, industry, and immortality. To the Merovingians, it represented resurrection, the endless cycle of life and death, order born from chaos. Just as bees transformed sunlight into honey, the kings of the Franks believed they too transformed divine will into earthly rule. But the bee was not their only symbol. Their myths told of a far deeper origin, one that reached beyond land, beyond history, into the tides of the unknown. It was said that the dynasty's founder, Merovech, was conceived between a mortal queen and a mysterious creature from the sea, half man, half beast, born of the depths. His name itself carried the whisper of the waters. Merovech, born of the sea. To later chroniclers, this legend seemed heretical, almost blasphemous. But to the Merovingians, it was proof of sacred legitimacy. The sea, vast and eternal, was the realm of creation itself. From its depths came all life, and so from it came their bloodline. Their power, therefore, was not a matter of conquest or coronation, but of natural law. They were heirs of the elements, ordained not by men, but by the earth and the sea. In this worldview, symbols carried power as real as armies. The bee, the sea, the hare, each a sign of divine selection. When Merovingian kings wore robes embroidered with bees of gold, it was more than decoration. It was declaration. They were the living intermediaries between heaven, earth, and the primal waters from which all existence flowed. Centuries later, Napoleon himself would resurrect the symbol of the bee, sewing it onto his imperial garments and banners. He claimed it as a sign of renewal, yet its true meaning was far older, a secret inheritance from the forgotten kings of Europe. Even in the Age of Reason, the bee still hummed with the echoes of ancient divinity. The story of the sea-born ancestor endured as well, reshaped, reinterpreted, but never forgotten. To believers, it was proof that the Merovingians were a bridge between two worlds, the natural and the divine, the mortal and the eternal. In their mythology, the sea was not chaos, but memory, the place from which all things return and are reborn. The combination of the bee and the sea formed a dual symbol of sovereignty, one of eternal labor and harmony, the other of mystery and origin. Together, they told a story older than kingdoms, that true power flows not from conquest, but from connection. In a world that measured greatness by battles won and thrones seized, the Merovingians stood apart. Their rule was a ritual, a rhythm synchronized with the cosmos. They did not claim to dominate nature, they claimed to belong to it. And perhaps that is why their legend endures. For even as empires rise and fall, and names fade into dust, the bee still gathers its golden light, and the sea still whispers of ancient kings, whose power was born not from man's will, but from the eternal pulse of the earth itself. The 6th century dawned upon a Europe divided, a continent still reeling from the collapse of Rome. Power had fractured into 1,000 warring pieces, where tribes became kingdoms and kings became legends. Amid this chaos, one name began to echo across the valleys of Gaul and into the chronicles of time, the Merovingians. They were not just rulers of men, but heirs, it was said, to a divine prophecy, a bloodline chosen by destiny itself. It began as whispers in monasteries, carried by monks who guarded secrets as fiercely as scripture. A prophecy, they said, spoke of a sacred line, one that would guide Christendom through the ages, blending the holy and the royal into one unbreakable covenant. Some claimed it came from the Sibylline scrolls, others from hidden gospels buried beneath centuries of silence. But to the Merovingians, it was truth. Proof that their reign was not merely inherited, but ordained. Europe at the time was no cradle of peace. Pagan rituals still lingered beneath Christian prayers, and faith itself had become a weapon. The Church sought to crown its own authority, yet the Merovingians held something far older than papal blessing, the belief that their blood carried divine essence. Their kings were said to rule by right of birth, not papal decree. Their crowns were woven from destiny, not gold. In this fractured world, prophecy became politics. Every war, every alliance, every betrayal was justified not merely by power, but by divine intention. When Clovis's descendants divided the Frankish realm among themselves, the dream of unity began to splinter. Brother turned against brother, and the sacred bloodline that once united Gaul now threatened to drown it in war. Yet still, the legend endured, that from this blood one day would rise a ruler to restore divine order to the world. Ancient texts spoke of a Rex Justus, a just king, chosen be, I heaven, destined to bring peace to a divided Christendom. To the Merovingians, that figure was no stranger from prophecy. It was themselves. Their seal bore not only symbols of earthly might, but celestial alignment. To question their rule was to question fate itself. As centuries passed, the myth deepened. The Merovingian court became a stage for mystics, druids, and priests, men who spoke of hidden knowledge and sacred signs. It was said that in the stars one could trace the pattern of their destiny. Even their blood, some claimed, bore divine traits, healing, insight, and the sacred mark of the chosen. The Church watched this belief with unease. A king who ruled by divine lineage threatened the spiritual monopoly of Rome, and so began a quiet war, not fought on battlefields, but in doctrine and silence. To weaken the Merovingian name was to reclaim control over heaven's narrative. But the prophecy refused to die. Long after their political power waned, the whispers persisted, that their bloodline survived, hidden, waiting for the moment when the world would again call for divine kingship. Some said it ran through monasteries and noble houses, others that it mingled into the fabric of Europe itself. And even today, the legend endures, a haunting echo of a time when kings claimed to rule not by conquest, but by cosmic design. The prophecy of the sacred bloodline became more than history. It became a mirror reflecting humanity's oldest desire, to believe that our destinies are written not in power, but in the stars. For in the fractured kingdoms of early Europe, the Merovingians offered a dangerous idea, that the right to rule could be born from heaven's will, and that somewhere, hidden among us, the blood of kings still flows. In the heart of early medieval Europe, two forces rose to shape the destiny of nations, the sacred altar and the royal throne. Together, they claimed to serve the same divine will, yet beneath the polished sermons and golden crowns, there lingered a quiet and dangerous tension. For while the Church sought to guide kings through the authority of heaven, the Merovingians believed they were heaven's chosen instruments on earth. Their alliance began as necessity. In a world still shadowed by pagan roots, unity under the banner of faith offered power, both spiritual and political. When Clovis I accepted baptism, it was more than a conversion. It was a pact. The Church gained a protector, and the Merovingians gained legitimacy. The waters of that baptism did not just wash away sin, they washed away doubt, giving divine sanction to a dynasty that would rule the Franks for generations. Yet even as incense filled cathedrals and crosses crowned banners, the partnership between bishop and king was never built on trust. Each understood the other's ambitions too well. The Church, with its scriptural wisdom and its invisible empire of souls, sought to tether the power of kings beneath the authority of God, or more precisely, beneath the authority of Rome. The Merovingians, in turn, saw themselves as living sacraments, rulers whose blood carried divinity itself, beyond the reach of clerical decree. In councils and courts, their rivalry simmered beneath ritual. A bishop's blessing was both a prayer and a warning. A royal gift to the Church was both devotion and reminder. The line between faith and control blurred as each side built cathedrals, one of stone, the other of influence. The Church offered salvation, the crown offered protection, but both hungered for something more eternal, dominance over the soul of Europe. The tension was most visible in the crowning of King's Eve. Coronation became a negotiation. Who anointed whom? Was a ruler sacred by nature of his birth, or only through the Church's blessing? To the Merovingians, the answer was clear. Their divine right was inherent, older even than Rome itself. Their long hair, their sacred symbols, and their mystical lineage were proof of a covenant that no priest could bestow or revoke. But the Church was patient. Where swords failed, words endured. Through scripture, doctrine, and the careful weaving of myth, it began to redefine divine authority. No longer was kingship a birthright from heaven. It became a duty under God's representatives on earth. Bit by bit, the Church reclaimed its role as gatekeeper between man and the divine, and the throne began to feel the tightening of its chains. Still, for a time, the alliance held. Fragile, uneasy, but necessary. Together they built monasteries and minted coins, spread Christianity across Europe's wild frontiers, and tamed the chaos that had followed Rome's fall. But beneath their shared triumphs ran a current of silent rivalry, a spiritual tug-of-war that would one day decide who truly ruled Christendom: the king with his crown, or the priest with his chalice. In the dim candlelight of cathedrals, as monks whispered prayers for peace, the struggle continued, unseen yet unending. The church needed the sword, the crown needed the cross, but each feared the other's shadow. And so, across the centuries, this fragile alliance became the heartbeat of medieval Europe, a balance between power and piety, ambition and belief. For every king who sought to rule by divine right, there stood a priest ready to remind him that even a crown must bow before heaven. The Merovingians may have worn the symbols of eternity, but the church held something more dangerous: the power to write eternity's story. In the shadowed halls of medieval cathedrals, beneath the echoes of sacred hymns, there existed another kind of ceremony, one the world was never meant to witness. For the Merovingians, kingship was not granted by man nor by the church's blessing alone. It was awakened through secret rites that bound the ruler not just to his people, but to forces far older than the cross or the crown. To the common eye, a coronation was a spectacle of grandeur. Incense rising through vaulted stone, priests chanting litanies, and the king kneeling before the altar as holy oil touched his brow. Yet behind the ritual's visible beauty lay an older layer, a whisper from pre-Christian traditions that refused to fade. For the Merovingians, kingship was not only divine by faith, but elemental by nature. The ceremony marked a transformation, the merging of mortal blood with the eternal pulse of the earth itself. These were not mere legends. Ancient texts speak of oaths taken at midnight vigils, of initiations performed in chambers beneath the church, far from the eyes of the clergy and the crowd. The king-to-be would descend into darkness, symbolically dying to the world of men, only to re-emerge as something more, a bridge between heaven and earth, between the divine unseen and the mortal realm. Some accounts tell of symbols traced upon the body in sacred oils, sigils representing the four elements: fire for strength, water for wisdom, air for divine breath, and earth for lineage. Others tell of relics used in the rite: golden bees, ancient swords, or fragments of stone said to hum with the memory of the gods. Each act carried meaning lost to time, preserved only through the whispers of initiates who swore silence under threat of death. The church, of course, turned a wary eye toward such mysteries. It sanctioned coronations but sought to cleanse them of their pagan echoes. Yet even as bishop's office, I aided, traces of the old faith endured, hidden beneath Christian symbolism, embedded in gestures and words few truly understood. When the anointing oil was applied, it was said not only to sanctify, but to ignite the divine spark within the royal blood. To the Merovingians, that spark was proof that kings did not simply rule by God's will, they embodied it. In the chronicles of later centuries, fragments of these rites resurface in strange places, in the oaths of knights, in the founding rituals of secret orders, and in the architecture of cathedrals themselves. Some historians have noted that the labyrinths beneath Chartres and Reims, two coronation sites of French kings, mirror initiation paths designed to symbolically purify the spirit before enlightenment. Could these have been remnants of those early royal awakenings, encoded into stone for those who knew how to read them? It is said that only a handful of priests were ever permitted to witness the true ritual, men chosen for their loyalty, not to Rome, but to the bloodline itself. These guardians of the rite became part of a silent order. Their knowledge passed in secret from generation to generation, ensuring the ancient covenant would never be lost. But in time, as dynasties rose and fell, as the church tightened its grip upon Europe's soul, the old rituals faded from memory. The light of the sacred fire dimmed, replaced by ceremony without meaning, tradition without understanding. The sacred became symbolic, the mystery, mere pageantry. And yet some claim the rites were never truly abandoned, only hidden. That deep within certain cathedrals, beneath stone altars and forgotten vaults, the echoes of those coronations still linger. For the Merovingians believed that kings were not made, they were revealed. And in that belief lies a haunting question. If the sacred blood still flows through unseen heirs, does the ancient ritual still await its next awakening, somewhere beneath the silence of Europe's oldest cathedrals? In the cold winter of the year 679, deep within the forests of Lorraine, a king fell to an assassin's blade. Dagobert II, last of the true Merovingians, was struck down while hunting, his body left among the trees, and his name soon erased from the chronicles of the church. Officially, it was the end of a dynasty. Unofficially, it was the beginning of a legend. To history, Dagobert's reign was brief and turbulent. Exiled as a child by the scheming power brokers of his own court, he was sent to Ireland, a land of monks and mystics. There, far from the palaces of Gaul, the young prince was raised not as a monarch, but as a scholar, a man of both wisdom and faith. Yet even in exile, whispers of his destiny persisted. For the Merovingians were not merely rulers. They were symbols of divine right, believed to carry within their veins a spark of the sacred itself. When Dagobert finally returned to reclaim his throne, he did so not as a conqueror, but as a chosen heir. The people hailed him as the rightful king, the last light of a fading dynasty. But his return also stirred the fears of those who ruled from the shadows, men of the church and of the rising Carolingian faction, who saw in him a threat not just to power, but to the narrative of divine authority they sought to control. And so, in a lonely glade near Stene, his story was brought to a violent end. The chronicles tell of a simple ambush, a political assassination disguised as misfortune. Yet from that forest clearing, another tale began to spread, one not of death, but of survival. According to legend, Dagobert's blood did not die with him. Some claimed his wife and child escaped to the south, protected by loyal followers who vanished into the mountains of Languedoc. There, in the remote valleys and secret abbeys of southern France, the Merovingian bloodline was said to have continued in silence, guarded by those soirees, and to keep the truth hidden. Centuries later, strange references begin to surface in monastic manuscripts and secret genealogies, cryptic notes about the royal seed preserved, and the sleeping king who shall rise when Europe is in darkness. Such phrases would echo through time, taking root in the hearts of mystics and historians alike. Was Dagobert truly dead, or had his lineage merely gone underground, awaiting a moment to return? The Abbey of Orval, founded near the place of his exile, became shrouded in mystery. Local legends told of hidden vaults beneath its stones, and of monks who protected ancient documents that could reveal the survival of Dagobert's descendants. Even the name Orval, meaning Golden Valley, would become symbolic in secret societies centuries later, appearing in codes and emblems linked to the guardians of a forgotten bloodline. For the Church, the Merovingian question was a dangerous one. If Dagobert's heirs still lived, their claim would challenge not only the legitimacy of later monarchies, but the very notion that divine authority could be granted by papal decree. Thus, history was rewritten, his name omitted, his reign minimized, and his legacy buried under the triumph of the Carolingians. Yet truth has a strange way of enduring. In medieval prophecies, Dagobert becomes the archetype of the hidden king, a figure who dies only in name, destined to return when the world has forgotten him. This myth of the sleeping monarch would later inspire countless legends across Europe, from Arthur in Britain to Frederick Barbarossa in Germany. But its roots lie here, in the story of a man whose blood was said to defy death itself. Today, Dagobert II stands at the crossroads of myth and memory. Was he a martyr, a monarch, or something more? a vessel of a sacred inheritance too dangerous to reveal. The forest that once hid his body now hides only silence. But in the whispers of secret orders, in the symbols etched into forgotten chapels, the old belief still lingers, that the king who would not die may yet live, not in flesh, but in the bloodlines that shape the world to this day. In the year 751, beneath the vaulted ceilings of a Frankish hall, a crown was quietly removed from a king's head, and with it, an entire dynasty vanished from history. His name was Childeric III, the last of the Merovingians. But even as the church declared his reign over, whispers began to grow. Was this truly an end, or merely a concealment? To the chroniclers of the time, Childeric was portrayed as weak, a shadow of his forefathers, a puppet king whose rule meant nothing. Yet behind this convenient narrative lay a deeper truth. His fall was not the collapse of a bloodline, but the culmination of a calculated transformation. For centuries, the Merovingians had ruled as both kings and mystics, figures whose divine aura unsettled those who sought to control Europe through faith and fear. The church could crown them, but never command them, and that made them dangerous. By the mid-8th century, a new power had risen within their own court, the mayors of the palace, administrators who served the Merovingian kings, but gradually seized real control. Among them stood Pepin the Short, a man of ambition and strategic faith, father of Charlemagne and architect of a new dynasty. With the blessing of the papacy, Pepin set out to reshape Europe's political landscape. But first, he needed to erase the one family that still claimed divine right by birth. In the records, Childeric's deposition appears almost bloodless, a simple transfer of titles. He was tonsured, stripped of his royal hair, the sacred symbol of Merovingian authority, and sent to a monastery to live out his days in quiet seclusion. It was an act heavy with symbolism. To cut the hair was to cut the connection to heaven itself. To imprison the king was to imprison the myth. But myths do not die easily. In villages and monasteries, tales spread that Childeric had not been truly dethroned, only hidden away, that loyalists had spirited him to safety, preserving both his bloodline and his crown in secret. In other versions, he became the sleeping king, waiting beneath the earth until the time came to restore the rightful order. Such stories were dismissed as folklore by scholars, but folklore has a way of preserving what history forgets. Even the church's attempt to sanctify the Carolingians carried traces of unease. Pepin's coronation was performed by the Pope himself, the first such act in European history, symbolically binding kingship to Rome rather than to the sacred blood of Gaul. It was a brilliant political move, yet also a confession of fear. For the church knew that if even one Merovingian heir remained, the question of legitimacy could one day return to haunt the throne. Centuries later, the legend resurfaced, whispered in monasteries, painted into manuscripts, and encoded into the myths of secret brotherhoods. Some said the Merovingian heirs had fled south, protected by orders who saw in them a sacred destiny that could never be extinguished. Others claimed their symbols, the bee, the chalice, the five-pointed star, continued to appear in unexpected places, carved into stone, hidden in coats of arms, woven into the art of cathedrals, built long after their supposed extinction. To this day, historians debate whether Childeric III was truly the last. Was he a powerless figurehead, or the final guardian of something the Church could not allow to exist? His death marked the official end of the Merovingian age, but not of its mystery. For power, like truth, does not vanish when buried. It waits silently beneath the ruins of kingdoms and cathedrals, beneath the words rewritten by victors. The fall of Childeric III was not an ending, but a concealment, a retreat into shadow, where bloodlines and secrets continued to flow unseen. And as the Carolingians rose to glory, the world forgot the long-haired kings who had ruled before them. But somewhere, beyond the reach of history's pen, the ancient spark remained alive. waiting perhaps for the day when the forgotten crown would rise once more from the darkness that tried to erase it. History is written by the victors, and few victories were as absolute or as carefully constructed as the one that ended the age of the Merovingians. In the mid-8th century, Europe was shifting. The echoes of Rome had long faded, and power was fragmenting across countless tribes and fiefdoms. Amid this chaos, one family began to rise, the Carolingians. They were not kings, not yet. They were administrators, stewards of the royal household, men who ruled from behind the throne. But in time, their influence grew so vast that even the king himself, Childeric III, the last of the Merovingians, became little more than a symbol. The coup that followed was not a bloody rebellion, but something far more sophisticated, a rewriting of divine order itself. The Carolingians knew they could not simply overthrow the Merovingians by force. These were kings whose rule was believed to come from the heavens. To destroy them openly would be to defy the divine. Instead, the Carolingians sought to replace heaven's voice. With careful diplomacy, they turned to Rome. Pope Zachary, a man keen to consolidate the Church's power, was presented with a question that would reshape Europe. Who should be king, the one who holds the title or the one who holds the power? The Pope's answer was swift and historic. It is better that he who has the power should be called king, rather than he who is falsely called so. With that single decree, divine right was rewritten, not as a birthright, but as a favor of the Church. In 751, Pepin the Short, father of Charlemagne, was crowned king of the Franks. The ceremony was carried out with full papal blessing, an anointing that symbolized the marriage of faith and political control. It was the beginning of the Carolingian Empire and the official end of the Merovingian line. But what makes this moment so haunting is what followed. Once the crown changed hands, the cheese. Chroniclers of the new regime began their work, not as historians, but as architects of memory. The Merovingians, who had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, were recast as weak, lazy, and unworthy of their own legacy. Their mysticism was painted as superstition, their divine heritage dismissed as myth. Manuscripts were rewritten, archives erased, royal tombs sealed or forgotten. To the world, they became the do-nothing kings, les rois fainéants. But to those who looked deeper, the silence surrounding their fall spoke louder than any record. How could a dynasty that once commanded Europe's destiny vanish so cleanly? How could a bloodline said to be sacred disappear without a trace? Even the Church's motives remain suspect. In aligning with the Carolingians, the papacy did more than crown a new ruler. It secured control over the very concept of kingship. No longer could royal power claim to flow from divine ancestry. It now flowed from Rome itself. Every coronation after Pepin's would echo that shift, binding Europe's rulers to the authority of the altar. Yet whispers of the Merovingians refused to die. Monks in distant monasteries spoke of lost heirs, of hidden records preserved in secret libraries. Pilgrims carried tales of symbols, the bee, the chalice, the star, appearing in places where no Carolingian influence reached. Even in Charlemagne's own court, some murmured that the old kings had not vanished, but gone into hiding, waiting for their time to return. The Carolingian coup was, in truth, not just a seizure of power, it was an erasure of memory. A dynasty was not merely dethroned, it was buried beneath centuries of silence, its name surviving only in fragments and forgotten inscriptions. And yet, in that silence lies the enduring question. Can truth ever be completely erased? For every empire built on rewriting history, there remains a shadow beneath it, a reminder of the kings who came before, and of a bloodline that once claimed to rule not by decree, but by destiny. When the Merovingians vanished from history, their disappearance was not a natural fading. It was an act of deliberate erasure. Across the Frankish lands, royal tombs were sealed, names scratched from stone, and manuscripts rewritten to serve new masters. It was as if a dynasty that had shaped the soul of Europe had never existed at all. But history has a strange way of whispering through what remains. Archaeologists and historians have long puzzled over the void that followed the fall of Childeric III. Entire archives, once chronicling royal lineages and sacred rites, simply vanished. The monasteries that once served as the keepers of royal memory fell silent. Chroniclers who had recorded every battle and coronation suddenly ceased to mention the Merovingian name. It was as though a curtain had been drawn over a past too dangerous to remember. The destruction was systematic. Royal genealogies were burned or corrected, reshaped to legitimize Carolingian power. Ancient seals bearing the image of bees, the sacred emblem of Merovingian sovereignty, were buried or melted down. Even the burial sites of kings, once revered as holy ground, were sealed or forgotten, their locations erased from official maps. One of the greatest mysteries lies with the tomb of Childeric I, discovered centuries later beneath the soil of Tournai. When unearthed, it revealed objects unlike any other found in early medieval Europe: hundreds of golden bees, exquisite weapons, and a signet ring bearing the face of a king whose bloodline was said to carry divine origin. But when the tomb's treasures were moved to France for preservation, they too suffered a strange fate. In 1831, much of the collection was stolen, melted, or lost forever. Only fragments remain, enough to hint at something far greater, something meant to stay hidden. What was it about the Merovingians that so threatened the powers that followed? The answer may lie in the way they were remembered before the silence. To their subjects, they were more than rulers. They were sacral kings, believed to possess a divine connection that linked heaven and earth. They were said to heal with a touch, to dream prophetic dreams, and to trace their lineage to a figure whose origins blurred the line between man and myth. For the Church and the Carolingians, such beliefs were dangerous. If the Merovingians were seen as divinely chosen outside the authority of Rome, their legacy posed an existential threat. To erase them was not merely a political necessity, it was a spiritual conquest. But complete erasure is impossible. Even in the gaps and silences, traces remain. Ancient chronicles found in forgotten monasteries tell of missing kings. Local legends speak of tombs sealed by the Church for fear of what they contained. A handful of artifacts, rings, seals, fragments of golden bees, resurface in private collections, carrying symbols that appear nowhere else in European heraldry. Each fragment, each whispered tale, seems to point to a truth that history dared not preserve, that the Merovingian line did not die with Childeric III. It was hidden. And so, between the burned pages and the buried crypts, a quiet resistance endures. The past continues to speak in symbols and relics, in broken inscriptions and lost manuscripts, reminders that even the most powerful efforts to control history can never silence it completely. For beneath the surface of official chronicles, beneath every erased name and missing record, something ancient still breathes, an unbroken thread connecting the forgotten kings of Europe to a secret too great and perhaps too dangerous to ever truly disappear. When the last Merovingian king vanished from the chronicles, the world believed the dynasty had died. Yet in the quiet corners of Europe, among monks, scholars, and secret brotherhoods, whispers told another story. A story of survival, a story of blood that refused to fade. According to legend, the sacred lineage of the Merovingians did not perish with Childeric III. It lived on, hidden, protected, and passed through generations under the watch of those sworn to silence. Some say the bloodline merged with noble families in the south of France. Others believe it escaped into exile, concealed beneath the shifting identities of medieval Europe. To those who dared to look deeper, patterns emerged, coats of arms echoing the golden bees of Childeric, names that reappeared like echoes through the centuries, and wealth that flowed in mysterious, uninterrupted streams. The Church called it heresy. The Crown called it treason. But to many seekers of hidden truth, it was destiny. The idea of a living bloodline gained strength in the medieval era when Europe's foundations rested on the divine right of kings. If the Merovingians truly descended from a line both royal and sacred, one that predated even the Church's authority, then every monarch who followed was, in a sense, an impostor. The implications were enormous, a buried claim to the throne of Christendom itself. Ancient sources, some real, others apocryphal, began to circulate. They spoke of secret guardians who preserved the family's identity across centuries, the Ordo Custodes Sanguinis, or Order of the Blood's Keepers. To the public, they were obscure religious fraternities. But to those who believed, they were protectors of something far more profound, a lineage said to carry both royal and divine essence. In southern France, where the Cathars once held their mystical faith, the legend deepened. Here, stories told of a child Sass, pirated away after Dagobert II's assassination in the 7th century, his descendants shielded by monks and loyal nobles. The bloodline, according to these tales, flowed quietly into the families of the Languedoc, merging with the hidden orders that would later inspire the Knights Templar and the Priory of Sion. By the Renaissance, rumors of the hidden kings became part of Europe's underground mythology. Artists, philosophers, and mystics hinted at them in symbols. Bees in royal portraits, fleur-de-lis motifs entwined with crosses, and cryptic genealogies that seemed to defy historical timelines. Beneath the gilded surface of Christendom, a secret narrative pulsed. That divine rule was not a right granted by the Church, but inherited from a forgotten covenant of blood. In the centuries that followed, as secret societies rose and fell, the Rosicrucians, the Templars, the Freemasons, the idea of a sacred lineage persisted. Some believed these groups were not born from political rebellion, but from the ancient duty to protect something older than the Church itself, the blood of the Merovingians. To the skeptics, it was myth, a romantic fantasy stitched together by conspiracy and legend. Yet the fragments endure, names, symbols, crypts, and seals that seem to tell a story no historian has ever fully explained. Could a royal bloodline, carrying both human and divine legacy, have survived beneath the veil of time? The question remains open, suspended between history and myth, but in every age there are those who seek the truth, scholars, treasure hunters, and believers, driven by the same ancient whisper, that somewhere in the hidden valleys of Europe, a lineage still flows, carrying the legacy of kings who were never meant to die. A bloodline that waits, perhaps, not to reclaim a throne of gold, but to remind the world that history's greatest secrets are written not in books, but in blood. In the dim light of medieval monasteries, the scratching of quills on parchment echoed like whispers in stone. To the casual eye, these manuscripts were prayers, genealogies, and chronicles of faith. But to those who knew how to read between the lines, they were something far more dangerous, records of a secret the Church could never afford to see revealed. Beneath the surface of monastic devotion, an invisible brotherhood endured. They called themselves keepers, scribes, custodians of a truth carried not in words, but in blood. It is said that after the fall of the Merovingians, when the dynasty's last king was dethroned and the bloodline forced into hiding, it was the monks who became their silent protectors. Hidden in abbeys across Gaul and beyond, fragments of the Merovingian story were concealed in coded texts, cryptic references to the Fisher King, to the bee and the vine, and to the seed that sleeps beneath the cross. To a historian, these may have seemed like religious allegories, but for initiates, they spoke of a lineage preserved through centuries of chaos. In secret chambers, away from the eyes of bishops and kings, these monks performed ancient rites, rituals blending early Christian mysticism with something older, something far closer to the Merovingian spirit of sacred kingship. They believed the royal bloodline carried not just authority, but divine resonance, a spiritual frequency that connected heaven and earth. As empires rose and fell, this hidden order evolved. What began as monastic guardianship slowly extended its reach into courts and kingdoms. Certain families, chosen by the order, were bound through oath and marriage to the surviving descendants of the sacred line. Over time, monks became counselors, scholars became financiers, and from their quiet sanctuaries, they moved ever closer to the centers of power. By the high Middle Ages, their influence could be felt behind the thrones of Europe. A quiet thread ran through history, linking abbots to kings, monks to monarchs, all bound by a covenant older than any crown. Even as the Church expanded its reach, the guardians worked within it, planting their symbols in cathedrals and manuscripts alike. Bees carved into altar stones, fleur-de-lis motifs woven into vestments, and stars placed precisely where Scripture met geometry. They never sought open power. Their purpose was preservation. The sacred bloodline, according to their creed, was not meant to rule again, but to survive until the world was ready to remember. In later centuries, these same guardians would inspire the formation of more structured secret societies, the Templars, the Rosicrucians, and the mysterious Priory of Sion. All shared the same echoes, a belief in hidden knowledge, a sacred heritage, and a divine mission to protect truth from corruption. Their message was whispered across ages: the crown of light must never be lost. To modern historians, the idea of monks guarding a royal secret might seem like myth, but the evidence lingers, in manuscripts sealed in monastic libraries, in illuminated pages filled with strange sigils, and in cryptic genealogies that reappear across centuries. Some even claim that a select few of these orders still exist today, hidden behind charitable foundations and scholarly institutions, their original purpose long forgotten by all but a handful of initiates. Whether they were protectors of blood or merely of an idea, one thing remains undeniable. The legacy of the Merovingians was never fully erased. It was rewritten, recoded, and preserved by those who believed that truth, no matter how deeply buried, would one day surface again. And so the monks became monarchs, the scribes became stewards of destiny, and through the silent corridors of history, the guardians all of the sacred secret still watch, waiting for the world to remember the kings it chose to forget. They were warriors in white robes, marked by the Crimson Cross, a symbol said to represent sacrifice, purity, and divine duty. But behind their chivalric vows and holy wars, the Knights Templar carried a secret purpose. For centuries, history told us they fought for Jerusalem. Yet the deeper you look, the more it seems their mission was never about the city itself, but about what or who it protected. Founded in the early 12th century, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon began as a small brotherhood of 9 knights. They pledged to defend Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. But soon after their founding, something strange occurred. For 9 years, they occupied the Temple Mount, the most sacred site in Jerusalem, digging beneath its ruins. No records tell us what they found. But when they emerged, everything changed. The Templars went from poor knights to one of the richest and most influential organizations in medieval Europe. Kings owed them debts, popes granted them immunity, and yet their power seemed to grow not from gold, but from knowledge, something unearthed beneath the stones of Solomon's temple. What could it have been? Some believe the Templars discovered ancient documents, genealogies, relics, or proof of a lineage stretching back to the time of Christ. To others, they found evidence of the Merovingian bloodline itself, the sacred descent of kings who claimed divine right not by papal decree, but by inheritance from a forgotten covenant. It is said that within the Templar ranks, only a select few understood this secret. They called it the Great Work, a divine mission to protect the living legacy of Jerusalem. Their outward purpose may have been military and religious, but within their hidden circles, the order functioned as guardians of something much older than the Crusades, the bloodline of sacred kingship. The symbols of the Templars echo this belief. The 2 riders on a single horse, signifying unity of body and spirit, the rose and cross appearing centuries before the Rosicrucians, the bees and fleur-de-lis carved into their churches in France, marks that once adorned the tombs of the Merovingians, each a whisper of continuity, a silent acknowledgement of their true allegiance. As the order's power expanded, the church grew uneasy. The Templars were too wealthy, too independent, and, perhaps most dangerously, too close to truths that challenged the church's authority. They spoke of a bloodline older than Rome, of divine power not granted by the Pope, but flowing through veins that predated the Vatican itself. By the early 14th century, that knowledge became their downfall. In 1307, on the orders of King Philip IV of France, himself deeply indebted to the Templars, the entire order was arrested in a single day. Under torture, they confessed to heresies no man could verify, worshipping mysterious heads, denying Christ, performing secret rites. But beneath these accusations lay a deeper motive, the need to silence them before the secret they guarded could be revealed. As Grand Master Jacques de Molay burned at the stake, he is said to have cursed both the king and the Pope who condemned him. Yet his final words carried a darker implication, that the Templar order and its secret would rise again. Some say it did, that the surviving Templars fled to Scotland, to Portugal, and to the mountains of Languedoc, lands already tied to the Merovingian mystery. There they merged with older guardians, continuing their silent watch over the bloodline they once vowed to protect. Whether legend or truth, the Templar connection endures. Their crosses still mark the ruins of cathedrals, their symbols still hidden in art and architecture. And perhaps, within those forgotten stones, the story of the sacred blood still sleeps, waiting for those who dare to see that the knights who once fought for God may have been guarding something far more human and far more divine. Across the great cathedrals of Europe, in places where sunlight bends through stained glass and silence hums like prayer, lie secrets not written in any holy book. Look closely at the stones, the carvings, the patterns etched into walls and ceilings. You'll find them: bees, chalices, five-pointed stars, and intricate spirals woven through sacred geometry. These are not random decorations. They are echoes, whispers left by those who once believed that divine truth could be spoken not in words, but in symbols. Among historians and mystics alike, these marks are said to belong to a forgotten lineage, the Merovingians, kings who ruled not just by sword or scripture, but by what they claimed was divine inheritance. Their blood, it was said, carried the essence of heaven and earth alike. And when that bloodline vanished from power, its symbols remained, hidden in the stones of churches, chapels, and monuments across medieval Europe. Take, for instance, the bee. It appears in unexpected places, on the tomb of Childeric I, one of the earliest Merovingian kings, where golden bees were found scattered among his grave goods. Napoleon, centuries later, would adopt the same emblem, perhaps unknowingly reviving a symbol of eternal kingship. To the Merovingians, the bee represented resurrection, divine order, and the sacred union between ruler and nature. It was a reminder that their power flowed not from conquest, but from the natural and celestial harmony of the world itself. Then there is the chalice, the cup of divine blood. In Christian tradition, it became the Holy Grail. But in Merovingian lore, it held another meaning, not an object, but a lineage. A vessel of sacred blood, passed through generations. You can still find it today, carved into the facades of Gothic cathedrals, often hidden within larger patterns of vines and stars. It is as if the architects, many of whom were members of secret brotherhoods, were encoding a message. The Grail was never a thing to be found, but a truth to be remembered. And what of the stars? The five-pointed figure, the pentagram, appears again and again in medieval architecture, on portals, windows, and floor mosaics. Long before it became misunderstood, it symbolized the human form, the balance of elements, and the divine harmony between the cosmos and mankind. To the builders of these cathedrals, it was a signature of sacred geometry, a map connecting heaven and earth. Some scholars claim these symbols were mere artistic flourishes, but their persistence across centuries, across distant regions, suggests intention. The same motifs appear in Rennes-le-Château in southern France, a region long associated with the Priory of Sion and the Merovingian mysteries. In the heart of these churches, geometry becomes language, a silent sermon for those who knew how to read it. The masons who built these temples were more than craftsmen. Many belonged to esoteric guilds, keepers of ancient knowledge that blended religion, mathematics, and mysticism. They believed that truth could be hidden in proportion and shape, that to build in perfect harmony was to honor God's creation itself. Through them, perhaps, the old Merovingian legacy endured, not through thrones or crowns, but through stone and light. Walk into any great cathedral, Chartres, Reims, Notre Dame, and you will feel it. The air hums with more than faith. The walls seem alive, as if carrying a memory too sacred to name. Beneath their arches, sunlight paints symbols that shift with every hour, like messages revealed only to those who wait. The Merovingians may have faded from the pages of history, but their presence lingers in these eternal structures. The bees, the chalices, the stars, they are not relics of art, but echoes of a covenant. A reminder that while kings may fall, and empires vanish, the language of the divine once carved in stone never truly dies. In the quiet corners of European history, where legend and secrecy intertwine, there exists a name whispered through centuries, the Priory of Sion. To most, it is little more than a myth, a fabrication of conspiracies and imagination. But to others, it represents something far older, a silent brotherhood dedicated to guarding the greatest secret of all, the survival of a sacred bloodline. The story begins in the shadows of medieval France. According to documents discovered in the mid-20th century, the dossier secrets, the Priory of Sion was founded in 1099, the very same year the Crusaders captured Jerusalem. Its purpose was said to be more than religious or political. Beneath the cloak of piety, the priory claimed to be the guardian of an ancient truth, that the blood of the Merovingians, the divine kings of early France, still flowed through living heirs. If true, this would mean that the line of Christ's supposed descendants, long thought lost to time, continued, hidden within Europe's noble families. It was a claim that threatened the very foundation of church and state. The priory's story intersects with that of another secret order, the Knights Templar. Some believe the Templars were the priory's militant arm, the sword that protected the sacred blood, while the priory itself remained the unseen mind behind the mission. While the Templars perished under the flames of persecution, the priory allegedly survived, dissolving into the labyrinth of European secret societies. Through the centuries, its influence flickered like candlelight, appearing in the lives of artists, scientists, and philosophers who carried hidden knowledge. Names like Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Victor Hugo, and Claude Debussy appear on lists said to record the priory's grand masters. Each was a visionary, a man of mystery, perhaps chosen not for their fame, but for their ability to veil truth in art and symbol. Their works often contained coded messages, sacred geometry in paintings, veiled allegories in novels, harmonic structures that reflected cosmic order. These were not accidents. To those who believe, they were breadcrumbs, signs that the priory's mission continued beneath the surface of culture, shaping thought from the shadows. In the small village of Rennes-le-Château, the legend burns brightest. There, a humble priest named Berenger Saunière supposedly stumbled upon documents revealing the bloodline's survival. Overnight, he became inexplicably wealthy, rebuilding his church with symbols tied to both the Templars and the Merovingians, a devil guarding holy water, inscriptions hinting at secret unions of blood and faith. Whether he discovered a literal treasure or an ideological one, no one knows. But his actions reignited the myth, and with it, the idea that the Priory of Sion still watched over a truth too powerful to reveal. Modern historians often dismiss the Priory as an elaborate hoax, a 20th century invention built upon medieval myth. Yet the question remains, why does the idea persist? Why do these names, these symbols, and these patterns keep resurfacing across centuries? Perhaps because somewhere within Europe's hidden archives, the Vatican's sealed vaults, the libraries of old families, or the secret collections of esoteric orders, fragments of this story still exist. The Priory of Sion may or may not have been real in the way history records societies, but as a symbol, it embodies something enduring, the belief that power, divinity, and truth are often guarded not in crowns or churches, but in silence, and that somewhere among us, walking unnoticed through the modern world, the last echoes of that sacred lineage still survive, protected by those who vowed long ago to keep the light alive in the shades. There are stories that reshape faith, and there are others that threaten to shatter it entirely. Among the most dangerous are those whispered to have been erased. Scriptures said to tell of a divine union between the mortal and the sacred, between Jesus of Nazareth and a woman history forgot to remember. For centuries, such manuscripts have lingered at the edges of theology, dismissed as apocrypha, forbidden texts locked away in the vaults of the Church. Yet their contents, if true, would alter everything we know about the origins of Christianity and the lineage of humanity itself. The story begins not with power, but with love. In fragments of ancient manuscripts, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and other early Christian writings unearthed in the deserts of Egypt, a different image of Jesus emerges. One not of an untouchable divine figure, but of a man deeply human, deeply connected, and bound by a sacred partnership. These texts suggest that Mary Magdalene was not merely a follower, but a companion, a woman of equal spirit, a bearer of divine wisdom. Some passages, long hidden from public eyes, speak of her as the apostle to the apostles, the one chosen to carry secret knowledge after the resurrection. Others hint at something even more profound, that she carried a living legacy, a bloodline that flowed from the union of divinity and humanity itself. If true, this revelation would mean that the Holy Grail, the object so desperately sought by knights and mystics, was never a chalice of gold, but a metaphor, the sang real, the royal blood. A lineage, not a relic, a vessel not of wine, but of life. The Church, faced with such heresy, could never allow it to stand. From the earliest councils, these alternative gospels were deemed blasphemous and destroyed. The narrative was reshaped. Mary Magdalene became a repentant sinner, her voice silenced, her role erased. The divine was separated from the human. The bloodline was buried beneath centuries of doctrine. And yet the whispers never died. In secret circles, among the Gnostics, the Cathars, and later the Templars, fragments of this forbidden gospel endured. They spoke of a sacred marriage, a hieros gamos, meant to symbolize the unity of heaven and earth. To them, Christ was not just the Son of God, but the bridge between the divine and the human, and through that union, divinity itself was meant to live on within mankind. Some claim that this union produced a lineage, one that fled Jerusalem after the crucifixion, traveling through Egypt, across the Mediterranean, and finally into the heart of Gaul. There, under new names and new faiths, it took root, merging with the royal families of Europe. The Merovingians, perhaps, were its final echo, kings whose blood was said to shimmer with sacred inheritance. If this was true, the implications were seismic. It would mean that salvation was never a gift bestowed by an institution, but an inheritance carried within. That the divine spark lies not in heaven's throne, but in human blood itself. The Church's suppression of these manuscripts was not merely about control of faith, it was about control of truth. Because if humanity were to rediscover that the sacred lives within its own lineage, the power of the intermediary, the Church, would crumble. And so, the gospel of the bloodline became the greatest secret never told. Hidden beneath centuries of fear and fire, its message remained simple yet revolutionary: that divinity and humanity were never meant to be divided. That within us all, the story of that union continues, quietly, eternally, written not on parchment, but in blood. In 1982, a book shook the world of theology and history alike. Its title was simple yet explosive: Holy Blood, Holy Grail. What began as an investigation into medieval legends became one of the most controversial revelations of the 20th century. For within its pages lay a question that dared to rewrite everything Christianity stood upon. Was the Holy Grail not a cup, but a bloodline? The authors, Michael Bagan, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln, were not mystics or prophets. They were researchers chasing the threads of a mystery that had haunted Europe for centuries. The enigma of the Knights Templar, the Priory of Sion, and the vanished line of Merovingian kings. What they uncovered would send shockwaves through both academia and the Church. Their journey began in the small French village of Rennes-le-Château, a place already steeped in rumor and secrecy. There, a humble 19th-century priest named Béranger Saunière had inexplicably amassed a fortune after allegedly discovering hidden parchments in his church. Symbols of the Templars, cryptic inscriptions, and coded manuscripts pointed toward a secret that transcended wealth, a truth protected for centuries by secret orders. The researchers followed these clues across France, through archives, cathedrals, and crypts. Slowly, a pattern emerged, one that linked the ancient Merovingians, the Church, and a supposed society known as the Priory of Sion. The Priory, according to scattered documents, claimed to guard the descendants of a sacred bloodline, one said to originate from the union of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. The revelation was staggering. If true, the Holy Grail, long sought by kings, knights, and poets, was never a physical relic but a lineage. The sang real, the royal blood, became San Graal, the Holy Grail, through centuries of linguistic transformation. The Grail, they argued, was a metapt, whore for the womb of Mary Magdalene and the continuation of the divine line through her descendants. For centuries, artists and architects may have hidden this secret in plain sight. From the cryptic geometry of Gothic cathedrals to the symbolism of the Last Supper, clues appeared everywhere once the question was asked. Even the works of Leonardo da Vinci, some claimed, concealed a silent acknowledgement of this forbidden truth. Holy Blood, Holy Grail, presented no absolute proof, only a trail of connections, interpretations, and tantalizing coincidences. Yet it resonated deeply with a generation questioning authority, religion, and the narratives written by power. The book became a phenomenon, blurring the line between history and heresy, faith and forbidden knowledge. Critics dismissed it as pseudo-history. The Church denounced it as blasphemy, but millions of readers found in it a strange sense of liberation, the idea that the divine was not unreachable, but human, that the story of Christ was not only one of sacrifice, but of legacy. 2 decades later, the theory would capture the imagination of the world again through Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, a fictional retelling that brought these same ideas to the forefront of popular culture. But while Brown's novel was a thriller, Holy Blood, Holy Grail was the spark that lit the fire, a work that dared to suggest that history itself had been rewritten to conceal the blood of divinity flowing through human veins. In the end, whether truth or myth, Holy Blood, Holy Grail changed the way we looked at the past. It blurred the boundaries between faith and fact, between scripture and story. It reminded the world that beneath every cathedral stone and every ancient legend may lie a secret far older than religion, a story of blood, love, and the eternal question: what if the divine walked among us not as a god, but as a family? In 2003, a single novel ignited a cultural firestorm. The Da Vinci Code, written by Dan Brown, was more than a thriller. It was a phenomenon that blurred the line between history and fiction, between faith and forbidden truth. Within months of its release, millions of readers were swept into a mystery that seemed to whisper from the pages of time itself. What if the greatest secret of Christianity was hidden in plain sight? The story followed a Harvard symbologist, Robert Langdon, through a labyrinth of clues embedded in art, architecture, and scripture. But behind the suspense and chases, something deeper stirred, an ancient narrative reborn. Brown's novel resurrected the legend of the Holy Grail, not as a cup, but as a bloodline. The same radical idea first proposed in Holy Blood, Holy Grail now reached billions through fiction, transforming quiet speculation into a global conversation. Almost overnight, sacred art became suspect. The Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, the great cathedrals of Paris and London, all were reinterpreted by readers searching for hidden codes and symbols. Tourists flooded the Louvre, tracing imaginary lines between Mary Magdalene and Jesus, between geometry and divinity. Guides rewrote their scripts. Museums redrew their maps. For many, history had suddenly become a puzzle to be solved, and Dan Brown had handed them the first piece. The Da Vinci Code effect went beyond literature. It reshaped how people approached history itself, as something living, layered, and perhaps deliberately obscured. Scholars argued, theologians condemned, and yet millions kept asking, what if it's true? Could secret societies like the Priory of Sion have guarded a bloodline that stretched back to Christ? Could the Church have built its power on the suppression of a human truth, that divinity had walked among us not as an untouchable God, but as flesh and blood? The Vatican responded swiftly, labeling the book a clever fiction that distorted sacred history. Yet every attempt to suppress the discussion only fueled it further. In a world growing increasingly skeptical of authority, the idea of a secret history, of a church that hid more than it revealed, resonated profoundly. People began to see symbols where none were meant to exist, and stories where history had gone silent. The result was a kind of modern myth-making. Documentaries flooded television screens, connecting dots between the Merovingians, the Templars, and the Magdalene. Theories multiplied online, spreading like wildfire through early internet forums. For a time, even academic circles could not fully ignore the weight of public fascination. A fiction had reawakened the world's most enduring legend, the idea that a sacred bloodline still walks among us. But perhaps the most striking effect of the Da Vinci Code was not belief, but curiosity. People who had never cared for art, history, or theology suddenly found themselves studying Da Vinci's paintings, medieval symbology, and the politics of the early church. Fiction became a gateway to inquiry, a spark that reignited the ancient human desire to question what we are told to accept. 2 decades later, the echoes remain. Even as experts dismiss its claims, the imagery lingers. A hidden lineage, a suppressed truth, and a church built upon secrets too powerful to reveal. The Merovingian myth, once buried beneath centuries of dust, found new life in the digital age, carried not by secret orders, but by the imagination of millions. And in that sense, the Da Vinci Code achieved something extraordinary. It reminded the world that history is not a fixed narrative, but a living dialogue, a mosaic of belief, mystery, and interpretation. Beneath every stone, every canvas, and every ancient text lies a question still unanswered. Are we chasing myths, or uncovering memories too dangerous to remember? There is a thread that winds quietly through the centuries, a whisper carried by monks, troubadours, and mystics alike. It speaks of a king who never truly died, a monarch hidden by fate, destined to return when the world once again stands on the edge of darkness. To some, it is legend. To others, divine promise. but to those who have traced the shadow of the Merovingians, it is prophecy. In medieval Europe, the myth of the hidden king echoed through illuminated manuscripts and sacred hymns. Chroniclers spoke in veiled words of a royal line that could not be extinguished, a seed preserved by divine will, waiting to bloom in humanity's hour of need. This prophecy found form in countless guises: the fisher king of Arthurian lore, the sleeping emperor beneath the mountain, the last heir who will awaken when the balance of faith and power collapses. Among these tales, one name appears again and again: Dagobert, the last true Merovingian king, slain in exile, yet never forgotten. In some accounts, his death was an illusion, his lineage concealed by those sworn to protect it. To others, Dagobert became a symbol, not a man, but an idea. The promise that sacred authority would one day rise again, untouched by the corruption of earthly crowns or clerical deceit. The Church, ever wary of such legends, tried to silence them. A returning king, blessed by heaven yet independent of Rome, was a threat to both theology and empire. So the prophecy was pushed into allegory, disguised in parables, encoded in songs. Yet its pulse endured, finding refuge in the secret orders that guarded the old bloodline. The Templars, the Cathars, the Priory of Sion, all were accused in one way or another of believing in a king who sleeps beneath history's surface. By the time the Renaissance dawned, the prophecy had taken on a new dimension. Scholars spoke of a rex expectatus, the awaited ruler, who would restore divine wisdom to a world lost in greed and dogma. The Enlightenment tried to reason it away. The Revolution tried to bury it, but the myth survived, reshaping itself with every century. Even in modern times, it surfaces in strange places, in literature, in secret societies, in whispers among those who believe that symbols hold truths the world has forgotten. For some, the prophecy is not about a man at all, but about awakening, a return of balance between spirit and reason, nature and empire. The hidden king may not walk among us in flesh, but in the human longing for renewal, for a world once again guided by justice rather than conquest, wisdom rather than wealth. Yet others remain convinced the bloodline is real, that somewhere, hidden by time and secrecy, the last descendant of the Merovingians waits. And if the prophecy holds any truth, it tells us something deeper about our nature. Humanity has always searched for the returning light, the one who will set right what was broken, who will restore the forgotten harmony between heaven and earth. Whether it is Arthur's rise from Avalon, Christ's second coming, or Dagobert's hidden heir, the message is the same. Power may sleep, but it never dies. Even now, in the echoes of old chants and the fading pages of forgotten books, the legend endures, that one day, when the world once more loses its way, the hidden king will rise again, not as a conqueror, but as a reminder that truth, like blood, cannot be erased. Nestled in the quiet hills of southern France, far from the noise of modern cities, lies a land heavy with whispers, a place where myth and memory seem to breathe through the stones. Languedoc. Once home to heretics and mystics, poets and knights, this sun-drenched region hides beneath its beauty a secret as old as Europe itself. Beneath ruined abbeys and forgotten chapels, in monasteries that time seems to have spared, there are archives few have ever laid eyes upon, manuscripts that may hold the key to one of history's greatest enigmas, the bloodline of the Merovingians. For centuries, Languedoc has drawn seekers, scholars, treasure hunters and dreamers, all chasing the faint trail of a truth hidden since the fall of the ancient Frankish kings. It was here, among the Cathar strongholds and Templar outposts, that stories of sacred blood and forbidden gospels found refuge. The monks who once inhabited these hills were no ordinary scribes. They wrote in codes, layered meanings beneath scripture, and preserved fragments of knowledge that the Church deemed too dangerous to survive. According to legend, somewhere beneath the old monasteries of Rennes-le-Château or the silent cloisters of Montségur, secret archives were sealed, containing scrolls that spoke of a lineage protected by divine will. These texts, some say, trace back to Dagobert II, the last true Merovingian king, and record how his descendants were hidden, sheltered by an underground network of guardians. Others claim the archives contain something far older, documents smuggled from the Holy Land by the Templars, chronicling the union of the sacred and the royal, a revelation powerful enough to challenge the very foundations of Western faith. Throughout the Middle Ages, the region became a sanctuary for those who sought an alternative truth, a truth unapproved by Rome. The Cathars, often branded heretic, CS spoke of a dual world, one ruled by light, another by corruption. They claimed to know of a secret preserved through generations, not merely a doctrine, but a living bloodline. When the Albigensian Crusade swept through Languedoc in the 13th century, entire towns were burned, and thousands were slaughtered in the name of orthodoxy. Yet, amid the ashes, some whispered that the most precious relics, and the knowledge that accompanied them, were spirited away into the mountains, hidden in vaults known only to a few. Even today, fragments surface, references in old parchments, coded maps, family crests that hint at an ancient allegiance. The Church long denied their existence, yet stories persist of secret Vatican envoys visiting secluded monasteries, quietly retrieving or destroying documents that might disturb the official record. Locals speak of hidden tunnels beneath crumbling abbeys, where monks once guarded relics by candlelight. There are even accounts of 19th-century priests, like Berenger Saunière of Rennes-le-Château, who supposedly discovered something extraordinary buried within church walls, something that brought him immense wealth and fear in equal measure. What exactly rests in those archives remains unknown. Perhaps they contain genealogies and sacred texts long forgotten. Perhaps they are empty, and the secret is only a myth built from centuries of longing. Yet the question lingers: why does the region remain under quiet surveillance? Why do researchers who get too close seem to vanish from the trail? Languedoc is more than a place. It is a riddle carved into the landscape of history. The songs of the troubadours, the ruins of Cathar castles, the mysterious symbols etched into medieval churches, all seem to point toward a story that was never meant to be told. And so the hills keep their silence. The winds that sweep through Montségur carry the same haunting murmur, that somewhere beneath the earth, in a sealed chamber untouched by time, lies the memory of a bloodline, a truth powerful enough to change everything we think we know about the birth of Europe and the divine right of kings. Beneath the bustling heart of Vatican City lies a labyrinth few have ever seen, a world of shadows, manuscripts, and silence. For centuries, whispers have drifted from its marble halls, hinting that within these sealed archives lies not just the record of faith, but the history the Church dared not reveal. The Vatican's secret archives, now renamed the Apostolic Archive, hold more than 85 kilometers of shelves and millions of documents that map the story of civilization itself. But among those countless texts, some believe there is one secret the Church has protected above all others: the truth of a sacred bloodline that survived through time. The Vatican's power has never rested solely on its religion, but on its control of knowledge. From the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, its scribes preserved ancient wisdom, while also deciding which truths were too dangerous for the world to know. The Church became the guardian of divine history, yet also its gatekeeper, shaping what humanity would remember and what it would forget. According to legend, the Merovingian secret, the claim of a bloodline descending from both royal and divine origin, was not lost with the fall of the Frankish kings. Some say it found its way into the hands of early church fathers, who recognized both the power and the peril it carried. To reveal such a lineage would threaten the very foundation of Christianity, blurring the line between mortal and divine, faith, and inheritance. So the knowledge was buried, locked behind papal seals, guarded by those who understood its consequences. Within those archives are said to be suppressed manuscripts, letters exchanged between kings and popes, accounts of heresies never spoken of, and chronicles of crusaders who uncovered truths in the Holy Land that the Church could never sanction. One tale speaks of a scroll, an ancient genealogy, smudged, ugled from the east by the Knights Templar, presented to the Vatican as both warning and weapon. It traced the blood of Christ through generations, linking it to the forgotten heirs of Europe. Whether myth or reality, it was enough, some say, to alter the course of empires. The Church's silence on these matters has always been strategic. Even now, access to the archives is tightly controlled, granted only to select scholars, and only to view specific documents under close supervision. Whole sections remain off-limits, sealed by decree. When asked why, Vatican officials insist it is to protect the sanctity of faith and the privacy of history. But to others, that secrecy suggests something far deeper, that the Church guards not only relics of belief, but evidence of blood. Over the centuries, those who have come too close to this truth have often met quiet resistance. Inquisitors erased heretical writings. Monks who questioned official doctrine vanished into exile. The Templar order, accused of blasphemy and purged, may have uncovered something that made them too powerful to tolerate. And yet, the thread of the story endured. Passed through secret societies, whispered by mystics, hinted at by painters and philosophers who cloaked truth in symbol. The Vatican, for all its grandeur, remains a citadel of silence. Its marble corridors echo with centuries of unanswered questions. What lies within its forbidden vaults? Ancient papyri sealed since the time of Constantine? Letters that reveal pacts between the Holy See and forgotten monarchs? Or perhaps, as some believe, the final proof that the Merovingian bloodline, the union of heaven and earth, never truly vanished. In the end, the Vatican's greatest power may not be in what it reveals, but in what it withholds. Behind those golden gates lies a memory the world is not yet ready to confront, a truth that could shatter faith, redefine history, and expose the shadowed alliance between power and belief. And so the silent watchers remain, guardians of a secret as old as the Church itself, waiting, watching, ensuring that some truths never see the light of day. In the quiet corridors of power, boardrooms, parliaments, and even pulpits, there lingers a question few dare to ask aloud. What if the sacred blood of the Merovingians never disappeared? What if, scattered across centuries, their descendants still walk among us today, unaware, or perhaps deliberately silent about their legacy? The idea seems almost unthinkable, yet history has a way of concealing truth beneath the ordinary. The Merovingian line, said to be both royal and divine, vanished from the records in the 8th century, but not perhaps from the world itself. From the ashes of their kingdom rose the Carolingians, who rewrote Europe's story. Yet scattered across France, Italy, and even beyond, obscure noble families claim descent from the long-haired kings. Their names changed, their emblems disappeared, but traces of their lineage, some believe, endured, hidden behind new coats of arms, buried in family archives, or encrypted in the genealogies of modern elites. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, historians and conspiracists alike began to piece together fragments. A marriage here, a title there, documents sealed in old monasteries and rediscovered by accident. A pattern began to emerge, suggesting that the sacred bloodline had never been extinguished, merely diluted and dispersed through Europe's ruling classes. The names of certain dynasties, from the Habsburgs to the Bourbons, and even certain branches of the British aristocracy, have all at one point been whispered to carry traces of that ancient line. But it doesn't end with royalty. In the modern age, power no longer wears a crown. It wears a suit. The great banking families of Europe, the architects of international politics, and even influential figures within the Church have been drawn into this web of speculation. Could some of them be the unknowing heirs of a bloodline that once aimed divine right? Could the same force that shaped the birth of medieval Europe still influence the corridors of modern power? The evidence is elusive, as it has always been. In the coded symbols of family crests, in architectural designs that echo Merovingian motifs, in the recurrence of ancient names, Dagobert, Sigebert, Clovis, scattered through genealogies, there are clues. Some investigators point to secretive orders and private institutions that seem to preserve traditions far older than their public charters suggest. The Priory of Sion, the Rosicrucians, even certain modern philanthropic foundations, all have been rumoured, rightly or wrongly, to play a role in safeguarding this ancient heritage. Then there are the stories of documents locked away in private vaults, of DNA studies quietly funded and abruptly abandoned, of Vatican emissaries making discreet inquiries into families whose ancestry defies easy tracing. Each tale adds a layer to the mystery, suggesting that the Merovingian legacy may not just be legend, but a living, breathing thread woven into the modern world. If true, it raises unsettling questions. What if those in power today, the ones who shape nations, economies, and beliefs, are guided, even unconsciously, by an inheritance that predates the Church itself? What if the struggle between crown and altar, blood and faith, never truly ended, only evolved? Of course, to the skeptics, it is nothing more than romantic mythology, a blend of wishful thinking and historical coincidence. But for those who look deeper, the coincidences pile too high. The same families reappear across centuries of influence. The same symbols resurface in art, architecture, and politics. It's as though history itself refuses to let go of the story. The Merovingian bloodline, if it survives, may no longer seek thrones. Its power lies not in conquest, but in continuity, in the subtle shaping of belief, commerce, and destiny. Whether myth or memory, its legacy endures, hiding in plain sight, in faces that pass us every day, in names that sign treaties and shape worlds. And perhaps that is the final twist of the Merovingian mystery. That history's most sacred secret was never lost at all. It simply learned how to blend into the modern age, waiting for those who still remember to recognize it once more. Since the dawn of civilization, power has never relied solely on armies or gold. It has rested on something far more enduring: belief. The ability to define truth, to shape what people see as sacred or profane, has built empires and broken them. And at the center of so many of those struggles stands the same silent force: myth. The story of the Merovingians is no exception. Whether their blood was divine or merely royal, the myth that surrounded them became a weapon, first of faith, then of fear. In the early medieval world, where religion defined every aspect of life, to control a narrative was to control destiny. A single legend could unite tribes, legitimize kings, or condemn entire peoples to oblivion. The Merovingians claimed their right to rule through sacred ancestry, said to descend from a divine union, a blood touched by the holy. It gave them authority beyond politics. It gave them sanctity. But when the Church rose to prominence, that same claim became a threat. A monarchy that could trace its legitimacy directly to heaven left little room for papal supremacy. And so, as the centuries turned, history was rewritten. The divine kings became pagan relics. Their myths, once sacred, were rebranded as heresy. Yet belief cannot be erased, only reshaped. In hidden monasteries, in whispered legends, the story endured. The bloodline myth became a symbol of resistance, a quiet rebellion against the idea that truth must always serve power. From the Cathars of Languedoc to the secret societies of the Renaissance, echoes of that same defiance resurfaced, each time cloaked in new language, each time challenging those who claimed to speak for God. The Church, the monarchies, and later the nations themselves all learned the same lesson: control the story, and you control reality. Whether it was divine kingship, manifest destiny, or national providence, every ideology found its strength in belief. People would die for myths long after they stopped believing in facts. And so, myth became an instrument, not merely of faith, but of manipulation. The Merovingian legend, true or not, revealed how fragile truth could become when filtered through power. Those who understood this began to wield it as a tool. Secret orders that claimed ancient lineage, rulers who styled themselves as chosen heirs of destiny, religious movements that promised revelation but delivered obedience. Even in our modern age, an age that prides itself on reason, the same pattern remains. We no longer call them sacred bloodlines or divine rights, but ideologies, symbols, and narratives. The tools have changed, yet the goal is the same: to command belief. In politics, in media, in religion, power still depends on the stories people are willing to accept as truth. The Merovingian mystery endures not because of its facts, but because of what it represents, a mirror held up to civilization itself. It reminds us that faith can enlighten, but it can also enslave. That history is not a record of what happened, but of what people were made to believe, and that every age, from ancient kingdoms to modern democracies, has its own priesthood of truth, those who decide what is heresy and what is sacred. Perhaps that is the real legacy of the Merovingians. Not their blood, not their crown, but the revelation that belief is the greatest empire humanity has ever built. Invisible, eternal, and fiercely defended, it is the unseen throne upon which every ruler, every church, and every nation still sits. And as long as people continue to believe, the manipulation of truth will remain humanity's oldest and most enduring mystery. Every mystery carries a shadow, not only of what was lost, but of what was never meant to be found. For centuries, seekers have chased after hidden truths, relics buried beneath stone, manuscripts locked behind Vatican walls, bloodlines whispered through time. Yet somewhere between revelation and silence lies the most haunting question of all. Was it ever meant to be discovered? The legend of the sacred bloodline of kings born from divine union has echoed across 1,000 years of faith and fear. It has inspired wars, burned heretics, and built cathedrals that seem to breathe with secrets. And yet, for all the fragments we've uncovered, the symbols in stone, the suppressed gospels, the hidden archives, the full truth remains just beyond reach, as if protected by something greater than secrecy itself. Perhaps that is the point. Some truths do not survive because they are proven, but because they refuse to be. They exist in the fragile space between history and myth, a place where facts blur into faith, and faith becomes something larger than knowledge. The Merovingian mystery, like the Grail it inspired, may not be a puzzle to solve, but a mirror held up to human longing, our endless desire to believe that somewhere in the past lies the key to who we are. Throughout the ages, every generation has tried to lift the veil. The Templars searched beneath the Temple Mount. The Cathars guarded their secret in the hills of Montségur. The Priory of Sion promised to preserve it in silence. Each came close, and yet the truth always slipped away. Reshaped, retold, reinterpreted. Like a river that never stops flowing, it changed form to match the mind that sought it. Maybe this is why it endures. A truth too complete would end the search. But one wrapped in mystery, one that whispers rather than speaks, invites every age to rediscover it. It gives meaning to the unknown. It keeps humanity reaching for something just beyond the horizon. The sacred bloodline, whether divine or symbolic, forces us to confront the nature of truth itself. Is it something we uncover through evidence, or something we awaken through belief? In the end, what if the purpose of the secret was not to be found, but to remind us that not everything can be possessed? That mystery has its own sacred power, one that humbles the mind and awakens the soul. In the quiet halls of forgotten monasteries, in the faded carvings of cathedrals, in the cryptic lines of suppressed texts, The same message seems to echo. Some things are meant to remain between heaven and earth. The search, not the discovery, is what gives the legend its power. It is the journey, not the answer, that connects us to those who came before and to those who will come after. So perhaps the greatest secret of the Merovingians was never their bloodline, nor the proof of their divine descent. Perhaps it was the realization that truth itself is sacred, and that to chase it is to touch eternity. And so, the question lingers, suspended between faith and history, as it always has. Was it ever meant to be found? Or was it meant to remind us that some mysteries are eternal, not because they are hidden from us, but because they live within us, waiting for the world to ask again? And so the story fades, not with an answer, but with a question that still echoes through time. The Merovingians, the Templars, the Priory of Sion, all threads woven into a tapestry of power, faith, and silence. Perhaps the truth was never meant to be uncovered, only glimpsed, like a reflection on still water, vanishing the moment we reach for it. But every mystery leaves its trace, waiting for those who dare to look deeper. As long as curiosity endures, the past will never stay buried. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through forgotten bloodlines and hidden histories. If this story stirred your imagination, remember to like, share, and subscribe to Mysteries of Earth. New revelations await, because every ending is just the beginning of another mystery.